everyone, and welcome to Black Race Matter series. I'm your host, Tammy Gibson, Sankofa Travel Her, and I am so excited. I've been waiting for this interview for a very long time. We have Gaynell Brady. She is the founder of Our Mammies, and she's going to talk about the great work that she's doing in Louisiana and also talk about Holt Cemetery that's located in New Orleans, Louisiana, that she frequents a lot. And thank you for being on Black Race Matter.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. I'm super excited. I'm also excited to work with you. And I know that this is the beginning of many more things that you and I will do together. I love the way that you travel around the country and all of the work that you're doing. And then the book as well. So keep up the great work.
Well, thank you. Right back at you. I follow you all the time. You're just doing some amazing work. I mean, I idolize you, and I'm so glad that we're finally having this interview. So we're going to get started. So my first question is to talk about your background and what you're doing in New Orleans.
So I started Our Mammies in 2013. I wanted to do this to honor the women on my family tree that I saw. They were all domestic servants, and I didn't really see a lot of things kind of like highlighting the work that they did and recognizing the sacrifices that they made. I always saw the word mammy, but it was always like the stereotype. And my grandmothers, my ancestors were called that. And I was like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't match the people that I know. So I wanted to do something that would always honor them and put them at the forefront. And I carry them with everything that I do.
Okay, awesome. Like I said, I follow you and I just see all the interviews and stuff that you be doing. And I just love the great work that you're doing. And so we're going to go and talk about Holt Cemetery, and you have a presentation. Would you like to do that right now?
Yes, okay. I would love to. We can start there. Okay. So for many of you who have, if you've attended one of my presentations on Holt Cemetery, it's pretty much the same. So it'll be a great overview. And if you have any questions, Tammy and I are going to do a Q&A at the end. And I would love to hear from you. We're a small enough group to where if you can probably come off of mute or enter your questions into the chat box. So today's presentation, I did this presentation 2 years ago, in fact, and it's still the same. I'm going to dedicate it to my grandma, Florence, actually my great-grandmother, Florence Jefferson Willett, who was from Clinton, Louisiana, and she died this month in 1957 when my mom was just a couple of years old, and my mom was actually named in her honor. Since this presentation, and as you all who are, if you're into genealogy, you know, as time goes on and you do more research, you'll notice that your information grows. And one of the things that I'm trying to do now, we actually found a photo of Grandma Florence. And so now we're just trying to verify that it's actually her. We're about 90% sure that this photo is hers. And the most interesting part of this photo is that nobody in the family had this photo. It was by the family that Grandma Florence and her mom, Belle Jefferson, that's who they work for. They were the ones that had the photo. It's also dedicated to all of these family members who are buried in Holt Cemetery. I have close to 30 relatives that I've uncovered that are all buried in Holt Cemetery. And as you can tell, looking at this long list of relatives, they've been buried in Holt since the early 1940s. That's actually a typo on Grandma Sarah. They've been buried in Holt since the early 1940s and as recently as the 1970s. Many of these people who are buried in Holt simply chose to be buried there because the other relatives were there. And some of the others, they were babies. And so it was the most affordable burial option for my grandparents. So what I'm going to do today is give you a brief history of Holt Cemetery, talk about some of the common myths that we often hear about Holt Cemetery, and then just give you a little bit of information on genealogy research at Holt Cemetery and at the New Orleans Public Library. So what you're looking at now is an image of Section A. A lot of my relatives are buried there. One of my favorite ancestors, Mama Belle, is in Section A. It is literally the first part that you get into when you pull into the driveway of the cemetery. So Holt Cemetery, the earliest history, it comes from an issue that we have now. Is literally overcrowding. So in 1879, Dr. Joseph Holt just reported that Locust Grove Cemetery was overcrowded due to yellow fever and of the epidemic in 1878. And so Locust Grove numbers 1 and 2 were ordered closed. What you're going to see throughout this presentation is that over the years and still present day, Holt Cemetery has been deemed overcrowded. So by March of 1879, there were some plans that were put into place for to bury paupers. The Locust Grove was home of, I guess you would say, paupers burials, and so the city recognized that, hey, we have to build a new cemetery in order to handle all of these burials and deaths that are taking place due to yellow fever. So according to my research and just what I've been taught by me, others who have researched Holt Cemetery, is that many believe that the cemetery was named after Dr. Joseph Holt, who was the father of the quarantine after these epidemics. Dr. Holt was a city board health official. And this is one of my favorite photos of Holt. It's from 1907. And there are many historical photos of the cemetery that are at the archives here in New Orleans. So by April of 1879, the mayor of New Orleans approved an ordinance that authorized the police, the administrator of the police, to lay off a lot for Holt Cemetery. And so this cemetery was to be located at the lower end of City Park on the corner of Metairie Road, which is now Metairie Road in St. Louis, which is now Diaz Street. So it's pretty much within the same area that Holt Cemetery is located now. But think about it, this is 1879. So from 1879, the cemetery was founded, up until now, there's still burials at Holt Cemetery. So by 1893, there was a resolution that was passed, and the Commissioner of Police and Public Building to employ a sexton for the cemetery. And he was only paid $50 a month. And for me, I guess 1893, that's a lot of money, but not for the task at hand. It was a lot of work to maintain this cemetery at this time, if you think about the time frame and our knowledge of medical services back then. Early 1900s, here we go again, another yellow fever epidemic. If you think about it, when you have an epidemic of any type, we just went through the pandemic with COVID, just think about like mass burials and lots of deaths happening between the epidemic and then World War I. Here we go again, Holt Cemetery was starting to become extremely overcrowded. And once I show you the burial process there, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So by 1906, the city council passed another ordinance to create a new Holt Cemetery along Monroe Street. And this cemetery was supposed to be 300 feet by 450 feet, but it was never built. So the site that you see now in New Orleans is the exact same cemetery that we've been working with. By 1921, Pastor J.D. Hatt, First Mission Baptist Church, literally said, hey, we need some relief down here. Holt Cemetery is extremely congested. It's overcrowded, and we need some help. Funny time is, this was also around the same time that there was this article written about a veteran named George Kelly, who was just 24 years old when he was buried at Holt Cemetery. So you have the pastor saying, hey, we have our soldiers buried at this cemetery. Holt Cemetery is home of many veterans. And, just thinking about now how we care about the veterans of our country, they sacrifice their lives to take care of us, but we're not doing our due diligence to honor them properly if the cemetery is overcrowded. So that's what Pastor was arguing for, like, hey, we have to get a better place to put all of our soldiers. So between 1920s all the way through World War II, we're still having burials at the cemetery. So by the 1960s, the late 1960s, The city stopped all of the coroner's burials from happening at Holt Cemetery. So in 1967, they created a new cemetery at the rear of Rest Haven Cemetery that is used for burials for people who are unclaimed or unidentified bodies. And Rest Haven Cemetery sits in the New Orleans East neighborhood. And if you've ever been to Rest Haven Cemetery, you would know that you go there after a heavy rain, you will need boots and your raincoat because you're just moving around through heavy mud. And so the coroner's burials take place behind that cemetery. And just think about like the geographical area of New Orleans. We're surrounded by water. You go down so many inches or feet, you're going to hit water. So the water table here is very high. So all of those burials that are at Rest Haven and those coroner's burials, they're constantly, every time a storm comes, a heavy rain, we have the shift or the movement of the soil. And I'll just stop there. I won't be any more graphic. So by 1986, with each administration, we're going to have where, the public outcry, and then with each government administration, you're going to have it where people are advocating for some renovation, preservation work at Holt, and then also to deal with the overcrowding. And so in 1986, Hirschberg and Associates completed a review of Holt Cemetery. And some of those recommendations that they made were to, hey, let's start excavating and filling these graves. Let's renovate Holt into like a garden style cemetery. Let's construct a mausoleum to handle the burials. But more importantly, let's establish a new cemetery. And this time they were thinking about, well, hey, there's some city-owned property near Dillard University. Let's push that cemetery over there. And then, of course, you have the people who advocates for Dillard and saying, hey, we don't want the cemetery here, like find another space to put the cemetery. So we're, constantly throughout the years of dealing with this battle of how do we address the need for affordable burials, but also how do we place this new cemetery in a place that works for all of the citizens of New Orleans and those surrounding us. So by 1995, another administration comes in and they decide, hey, we need to order a task force to take care of the cemetery. By this point, there are a lot of photos floating around showing the condition of Holt: overgrown grass, headstones knocked one way or the other. It was just a lot going on. So the mayor was like, nope, let's get a task force. Let's put some things into place. So they said, hey, let's increase the fees for burials. Let's increase some of our staff. And let's stop burials, establish a new cemetery near Dillard. Well, they're still burying people at Holt Cemetery. And that new cemetery at Dillard still hasn't happened. So one of the things that the city of New Orleans faces is the fact that Holt Cemetery is one of 7 cemeteries owned by the city of New Orleans. Carrollton's number 1 and 2, also known as St. Mary Street and Green Street Cemetery. I have a ton of relatives buried at Green Street. We also have Lafayette number 1, Lafayette number 3, Valence Street Cemetery, and then the other cemetery, the Indigent Cemetery that I mentioned. So that's a lot of cemeteries to maintain with such a small staff. So even in terms of the day-to-day at Holt Cemetery, there's the cemetery superintendent and the administrative assistant, basically. That's it. And then you have a maintenance team, a tiny maintenance team that goes around through all of these cemeteries to maintain them. As I mentioned before, the part that really strikes me the most about Holt Cemetery is the fact that it's home to 1,400 veterans. And all of these people fought in various wars all the way up to the Vietnam War. And there's a group that comes out every year for Memorial Day to basically clean the cemetery up a little bit and place flags on those cemeteries, but on those grave sites, but it's just not enough. And they do all of this out their own pocket without the financial support of the city. And so because of all of this history with Holt, there's a lot of myths surrounding the cemetery. If the photo that you're looking now is right next to the large gate that you would drive into, I remember a long time ago when I first started visiting Holt, they didn't have that paved road. That was all gravel road. And and it wasn't like a paved path that you could drive around. It was very gravel. And I remember my mom telling me when she would go to the cemetery for burials, she would always remember the big oak trees that are in Holt Cemetery. So if you ask people in New Orleans where their relatives are buried, they're going to say, "Oh, next to the oak tree," and it's like, which one? So the cemetery, I can truly say, is definitely a family cemetery. So one of the myths that we get a lot at Hope Cemetery is that the grave diggers, the ones who actually dig the graves for this the cemetery burials, that they're staff of the city of New Orleans, and that's not true. They are paid independently. So when you schedule a burial at Hope Cemetery, the cemetery administrators, whether it's the assistant or Emily herself, they contact them to seek a spot where your relative can be buried. So the way that things work is when you get someone buried at Hope Cemetery, you don't own that space. What the city does allows you the use of that space, and as long as you're taking care of it and there's a headstone there, they won't put a new person there. But if you don't put a headstone there and you don't take care of that that space, when the grave diggers go to find a new burial space, they use a little probe to push in the ground to see if that casket is still there. If they feel something, they don't go in that hole, they go and find another one. So part goes out to those grave diggers, but they are not paid staff of the city of New Orleans. They're all independent operators. I have seen them work in some really interesting conditions. Right now, if you think about it, it's extremely hot in New Orleans, and all of these graves have to be hand dug up. They can't use heavy equipment at Hope. They are out there with shovels digging the graves for burials. The other myth that we often hear about Holt Cemetery is just after the funerals, the grave diggers go and take the caskets out of the ground and reuse them for new burials, and that's not true. So because of the way that Holt is made, once the burial is done, and they try not to do burials or cover the holes up while the relatives are there, and as you can tell, think like about it, like people are very emotional at funerals, and so they have to take the proper time to make sure that there's enough soil on top of that casket. Even if they have to go and get soil from the 2 piles that they have at the cemetery, they pile that on that burial site to make sure that that casket goes deeply into the ground. Like I said, with New Orleans, if you dig down far enough in any yard, you're going to run into water. And that's just the way that our city is laid out. And so whenever those people are preparing a burial, say for example, if there was a heavy rain the day before, as fast as the gravedigger can clear the hole out, it's filling up with water. So they don't want to get back in that hole. Once they have it closed, they want to make sure that hole remains closed, and it's just against city health codes for them to go back in there and open a sealed casket to pull it back up.
Yes, your mama old.
So at Holt Cemetery it's a very active cemetery. Approximately 5 burials or more are taking place at Hope Cemetery per week. It is a very active cemetery with burials, and then also with people visiting Hope. A lot of people try to say that, oh no, people just drop people off at Hope and they never go back. I have never been alone at Hope Cemetery and all of the times that I visited the cemetery. The burial process at Hope, and I'm so happy that I was able to capture this photo after a rainy day. You see like the mud there, is great soil there. As I mentioned earlier, they probe that cemetery for an opening with like a long rod. So if there's a place where there's a headstone, they don't go in that area, but that doesn't stop them from going next to it, behind it, or in front of it. However, they have to find space for a burial. Once they locate the opening, like I mentioned earlier, they're preparing these sites by hand. And I have watched them, and they're digging this hole by hand. They're in the ground, and this mud is very thick, and they're hitting their shovels on a sheet of plywood to get the mud off the shovels. Here's an example of what I'm speaking of about the hole filling up with water at Holt. So the water table there, as you can tell, very high. And the grave, the sites will fill up with water prior to a funeral. So that means then the grave diggers have to get out there and to make sure that that hole is ready to receive the casket. And all of this is by hand once again. Once, like I mentioned earlier, once the casket is put into the ground, the burial site is filled with several feet of dirt to encourage the casket to sink. That's why I try to tell people, I know we want to put the very best, our loved ones in the very best caskets to send them off with all the honor and dignity that they deserve. But you want to get something that's going to decompose quickly, because if they're going in the ground in New Orleans, you want them to sink down and you want everything to break up and to return to the soil. You don't want to have something that's just going to be floating around forever because of the way that it's made. You want everything to break down. One of the other myths that I often get about Holt Cemetery is that all the burials there are only African Americans and their descendants. That's not true as well. Early records of Holt show that the burials of individuals that are buried at Holt Cemetery, these people come from all different ethnic backgrounds. In fact, another thing that's also that always say that, oh, all the burials are people from New Orleans only. That's not true as well. Those people who are buried at Holt Cemetery come from all over the United States. As I mentioned earlier, different ethnic backgrounds and different economic statuses. A lot of those myths, I'm not sure why they were created or just because of the way the cemetery looks, but I just feel personally that Holt just has its own personality, just like we do in New Orleans. We're the people from New Orleans are different from people from Baton Rouge, who are different from people from Shreveport. We just do things differently down here. So the other one is that, oh, Holt Cemetery is just an indigent cemetery. That's not true as well. As I mentioned very earlier in my presentation, that stopped in the early 1960s. All of those burials are taking place in New Orleans East. So the people who are buried at Holt Cemetery are not just the people who are just uninsured. Oh, it's just a poor people's cemetery. All of that, that's a myth. That's not exactly true. For me, and this is what I've experienced, the Heim family. Many people, as you can tell with this picture, the Heim family, that's many of their ancestors and their relatives. People choose to be buried near their ancestors. I've already mentioned it to my family. Don't put me in New Orleans East. Don't put me in Kenner. Put me in Holt Cemetery. Let me be in the center of the city with all the rest of my ancestors who are buried there. Not because I'm poor or because I lack insurance, it's because I want to be buried there. Another thing that people say about Holt is, oh, they don't have any burial records. That's not true either. The Holt Cemetery office has logbooks of burials from the mid 1950s to the present. Of course, there are gaps caused by personnel issues and also natural disasters. So think about things like Hurricane Betsy, Hurricane Katrina, things like that come in and just disturb the way that we do everything in New Orleans. And in fact, some of the books that for Holt Cemetery, they were in the basement, so they were sitting in water for days. And so some of those books still survived that, but many of them were just destroyed. And a lot of times people like to say that it's difficult to figure out the sections and the lots at the cemeteries. That's not true either. It is possible. You can get within a certain amount of feet. But remember how I told you that even if you get within a certain amount of feet, or even if you have that headstone sitting right there, always think about the soil beneath, right? Things shift around in New Orleans. Even our houses are shifting around. A lot of them are sinking. At Chalmette National Cemetery, where I used to work, many of those headstones sink into the ground, so they have to dig those back out and push them back up and straighten them out. This is a layout that was done by Emily. She helped me. She gave me this map, and I colorized it so that people can see there are clearly defined sections in Holt Cemetery. So this little thing right here you see is that road that wraps around the cemetery back to the opening. That's the shed, and then there's the ditch there. So you can kind of like get an idea of where your ancestors are buried based on the section. And depending on the time period, you may also get a grave number. And then you can use that to narrow it down by row and by section, and you could get within so many feet. The way that they assign these things, that depended on the gravedigger. The gravedigger were the ones that gave the numbers, and so many of them counted maybe from right to left, and some of them counted left to right. So that's the only variation that you get when it comes to those cemetery records, and just if they're available or not. And this is what Holt looks like above. And this is a Google map. You can see the roads. You can see the ditch there. There's the road. You can see that there's section A. And then also, like I mentioned to you guys, there were all of these oak trees. Some of them have been, not these, but some of the other ones were destroyed, of course, by natural disasters. And if you're not from New Orleans and you want to see what Holt is, this little area right here is the French Quarter. And then down the road right here is where Holt Cemetery sits, right on the edge of City Park. So it's pretty much, it's centrally located in the city. And then lastly, I just want to give you guys a little bit of information in regards to genealogy research. I did create a little guide that I have on my website, and I'll give you the website address at the end of the presentation. But there is a Holt Cemetery research guide that you can download and use. And if you have any questions about burials, or if you need assistance with locating burials, just shoot me an email, and if I can help you, I will. So there are two places you need to know about when it comes to burial information. Their records are either held at the Holt Cemetery office on Chapatula Street, or they're at the New Orleans Public Library. The things you're going to need before you contact either one is the date of burial, and make sure that they're actually buried at Holt. And you can verify this by looking on an obituary, or also on a death certificate. They should tell you where your ancestors are buried. So any of the burials that took place after the 1950s, they're in logbooks at the cemetery office on Chapatula Street. Prior to 1950s, those records are kept at the New Orleans Public Library. And if you see on this photo here, there's a little book here, one of the logbooks for Holt. You could tell that it was badly damaged by Hurricane Katrina, and these are some of the other logbooks for Holt Cemetery. And so here's our little gap timeline of the books that are actually available at Holt Cemetery. This is in that resource guide that's on their website, or if you are on your phone or computer, just take a screenshot and save it, because if your burial doesn't fall within these dates, then the Holt Cemetery office does not have information on these burials. Those logbooks are gone. So I'm gonna give you a second. If you need to, you can screenshot it, or like I said, it's available online on my website at ourmammies.com. So I know for me, I keep this handy, because a lot of times when you're doing research, you get sidetracked sometimes and you forget things, and you have to go back and reteach yourself. And you also need to know where you've already checked. So again, just take your little screenshot of this in case you have an ancestor or relative buried at Hope. You'll know if there's anything available for them. For example, if you're looking for someone that died in January 1951, there's a chance that their record is there because it falls within this window here. So again, if you get stuck, if you don't remember, just shoot me an email and I'll try to help you find it. At the Holt Cemetery office, I can tell you this, I've looked in many of those books and talked with Emily Ford a lot. The records are as good as the person who entered the information. Some of the superintendents and some of the folks did a really great job with documenting everything. Some of them, well, maybe not. So it just depends on the year that the person died and who entered their information on that day. So you may get the date, the name, the permit number, the place of death, sex, race, and age. And you also may get the undertaker, the lot sections, and then some of them have the plot location. And if they have the plot location, That's one of those situations to where they could get the burials down to a couple of feet and you'll know the area. This is a glimpse of what those cemetery books look like. I love flipping through, and you can see at the bottom, that's my grandma Florence. And you see female, you see her age, you see the burial permit number, you see the cemetery that handled the burial, you see that plot, you see that C, oh, go back. You see the C on there, it tells me where she is, section C, and then it gives you the row number and the site number. So it really just depends on who put that information in and how much did they actually put in. You also can see at the top, you see there's a baby, it says a coroner burial, and it says stillborn. So it just depends on what you're looking for and who you're looking for in the time period. So in 1970s, Clementine Bean, Miss Clementine, created a system. And what it did, she created a filing system to where she was grouping people by their plot location. And so all of those people, they have information in these file cabinets that are in the city's office. And there are 6 cabinets of lot records. Again, it just depends on when your ancestor died and what information is available, and if they have information in that folder for the particular plot that your family member was in. You call the office, I could tell you that they'll give you the section number if it exists, and the date the person was buried if it's available. Here's a closer look at one of the books for the cemetery. They will not send you scans or documents of the records. One of the things that they want to do is to eventually make the records be available to the general public. But the issue is that they have to stabilize the collection. So again, just working with them and trying to make sure that they have the resources they need to pay for that service to get done, because I know it will help a lot of genealogists locally, and then just folks who are also doing research from afar. And so also I wanted to just point out the New Orleans Public Library is pretty cool too with the records that they have available. They're doing a lot with work of putting some of these records available online. So this is another one that you can screenshot of archives.nolalibrary.org. They have a huge collection, and the staff there is super helpful. Always happy to serve. And even if you have a chance, you could go stop over if you're locally or if you're visiting in town. They're easy to work with. You can request an appointment if you're looking for a specific file. So you would just go to their website, click on genealogical materials. Once you're there, you could click on burial records. After click on burial records, you could click on municipal cemeteries, New Orleans, and then you'll see the list of all the cemeteries, and it'll tell you the ones that they have indexes for. And then there's the section that's actually on Holt Cemetery as well. So you see there's some from 1881, and then they have some from 1901 to 1953. So I just want to, give special thanks to City of New Orleans Division of Cemeteries, Emily, New Orleans Public Library, and then my good friend, sister Yael Gordon, who's like my little cemetery research buddy. Again, if you need information or if you need help locating a burial at Hope, you can definitely reach out to me, and I'll do what I can to assist you. I do it all the time.
Well, thank you, Gaynell. Keep that up so people can have time
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so we can keep that up. Thank you
Keep
so
it
much.
up.
It was very, very informative. I mean,
You're
thank you so
welcome.
much. I've learned so much. So one of the questions I have is, what is the fee for someone to be buried there? And then as far as you said that you have your family members, are your families together or are they just throughout the cemetery?
Holt Cemetery, the fee is less than $1,000. I don't know the exact amount. I know that they had an increase recently, but it's still less than $1,000. If I remember correctly, I can double check that for everybody, but I can say Holt Cemetery, Mount Olivet, and there's one other one that is the most affordable burials in New Orleans. They're the 3 cheapest cemeteries. All of the others, are expensive.
And
then
then,
as far as my family members, I have family members buried in almost every section of Holt Cemetery. They're not grouped together. Some of the earlier ones are in Section A, but then the others are all over. And as I'm doing this research, I'm finding more and more people, distant relatives. I found another uncle. I didn't know, I knew that my grandmother had a son, but I didn't realize he was buried at Holt Cemetery, and he died as a baby. So he's there. So I have a couple of aunts and uncles that are buried at Holt, as well as, great aunts, uncles, and distant relatives.
okay. You talked about, my question is there a certain type of casket that is used because you're in New Orleans? And then also you talked about the Gravediggers. How far does the casket go down? Is there a certain required feet?
There is a certain required feet. I can't think offhand, but just think of this long metal rod. I think it's like 6 feet, if I remember correctly, and then they put another 3 to 4 feet of soil on top. But me, for me, I always tell myself it can be 6 feet. However, by the time that rain comes in to New Orleans and shifts everything around, all we would need is to have a burial and then a hurricane coming in, and then we're going to have some shifting. And so I remember not too long ago, I was reading up on this a comment that someone wrote, and it said, "Oh, it's the most haunted cemetery because you see the bones floating around." And I'm like, that happens at a lot of cemeteries, and people are just not paying attention to it. I've seen bones at some of the other cemeteries, the more prominent ones, and it's just simply because of our soil condition here in New Orleans. All we need is a hurricane or one of those really bad storm systems, and we'll have the same issue at any point in Louisiana, or definitely in the southern Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. And then it could be any type of casket, right? For that, dealing with, New Orleans. Anyway.
It depends on the cemetery. Some of them have restrictions about the type of casket. So, like, remember the one that Medgar Evers was buried in? I think it's like a certain type of metal. Those take forever to break down. And if you think about, like, if you put something that's wood in the ground, that's going to break down a little bit faster, and those are often more expensive. So it's just, I understand that people, I can't tell anyone how to honor and bury their loved ones, but it's certainly something to think about depending on where you're being buried, especially in southern Louisiana.
So I've been to Holt Cemetery. I loved it. While I was there was a couple of people there, and I had conversation with them. And what I was so amazed about was how they decorated the graves. Is there
absolutely?
So is there like a story behind that?
As I tell people all the time, people from New Orleans or just southern Louisiana, we're just going to do us, and we're going to do us the way that we know how to do us. Even the way that we bury each other. Like, people, I was amazed when I talk to people. They say, "Wait a minute, you're celebrating the death?" Yeah, we do it a little bit differently down here. You'll see like a jazz second line, so it looks like we're celebrating, like, yay, somebody's dead. But in our mind, it's the way that we're sending this person home, right? And so we want to do this with the most elaborate jazz funeral. I've even seen a party bus in Hope one time, and it was literally they were following behind the hearse, and I understood it. I understand, like, some people. There's one grave at Hope. I don't know if you saw it, Tammy, all the way in the back. They have a mailbox there, and it's simply because that lady wanted to be able to write letters to her ancestor and put it in there. So you're going to find all of these types of things at Hope. And I think that's the part that makes it so wonderful.
Absolutely, because you won't see that in Illinois, Chicago. I mean, they'll just take it down or tell you, we're not doing this here. But, when I was there, I was just so amazed. I took so many pictures of the different decorations. So that's what really stood out to me. Speaking of that, if you can't touch on, if you know any civil rights activists, entrepreneurs, or musicians that are buried at Hope?
Let me say it this way. We know many famous ones like Buddy Bolden. He was going to be one of the most famous burials there. There's also a lynch victim, Robert Charles. He's there. But Gaynell is a genealogist. Everybody in that cemetery's history matters to me. They're all important. There are so many knowns and unknowns that are buried in Holt. So that's why I'm always fascinated when I get to talk to other family members about their ancestors' lives and the things that they contributed to the culture and history of New Orleans. So I consider all of their graves important, but Buddy Bolden is one of the ones that most people know because he was a famous jazz musician.
Okay. And from your standpoint, do you think that the city is doing what they're supposed to do as far as preserving and restoring to keep, the cemetery the way that it should be? And, and sometimes I've been to cemeteries where
Mm-hmm.
the descendants wanted to leave it as is. They don't want
Mm-hmm.
all these nice flowers and stuff. They just say, leave it be.
For me, okay, let me say this. The city of New Orleans, we have a long list of things that need to be done. And the cemetery is one of them, right? It's extremely important that we take care of our cemeteries. Holt is such a very special case. It requires very special care, but the most important thing it needs is revenue. And, for me, I'm one of those people, I always feel that it's important for us to be the leading force behind the preservation of cemeteries, especially one where I feel that my ancestors are buried, right? So I'm willing to work with the city of New Orleans, as I've done, in creating awareness about the overcrowding and creating awareness about the burial practices there. But there's still work to be done. I don't know how they'll make that work because I know they're trying to dedicate a lot of money to crime and street repairs and everything else. So the cemetery may not be an absolute top priority or even on the radar. But for those of us who are into history, culture, genealogy, it means a lot to us. The thing that also slows it down is the fact that it's still an active cemetery. So I can't, a person couldn't get in there to start that preservation work, which that you have to be very careful because there's still grave diggers probing, looking for burial sites. So things are constantly moving and shifting around them. I think before that, the preservation work can begin, we have to find another affordable burial space for people in the city.
So, when I look at the history of Holt Cemetery, I always see you. Do you have people that support you? Because you're out there with boots on the ground and you just out there, and I only see you. Do you get help from the community?
Let me say this. And it's with all of my work, Tammy. I'm just the weirdest little bird. For me, it sometimes could be a little old lady walk up to me and saying, "Hey, here's $5." To me, that $5 is gonna feel like 5 million, right? So I think the most important thing that I can do right now is just continue to create awareness. I don't get financial support for Hope yet, and it's simply because I want to be able to do it right. And that's why I really want to start that friends group, so that way we can receive those funds and start to support the preservation of those headstones. Like, I don't want it to necessarily go to our Mammies to make that happen. I feel that if we can get that friends group growing and bring in some experts on that board and others, I think that we can do some real work and let Hope be a model of how we can take better care of our burial sites.
Yeah. Well, I think of you as a bird that's soaring all over the ancestors, and they're definitely so proud of you. So you're that bird that's soaring and maintaining and making sure that the ancestors are resting in peace and dignity.
Yes,
So before I end, I always like to know what is next for you, what's amazing what you're doing with our Mammies, and also what would you like to see in the future of Holt Cemetery?
I'll start backwards. So what I want to see with Holt is, again, it's my goal to start this friends group, and so that way we can get the monies in to have a pot of money so that we can get some preservation work done, both of the actual objects and also the history as well. Being able to afford to get those books digitized, right? And then as far as our Mammies, one of the things I also want to do is, none of my ancestors except for one has a headstone. So if I can do that, I will put headstones there. even if it's just one for all of my ancestors that are buried there. I would love to do that at some point. It's on my list, but I keep getting into stuff. And speaking of getting into stuff, I'm still expanding on my space in the lower nine so that I can offer more digital and virtual programs like this one. So I'll continue to build on that. And then I'll continue teaching genealogy to our kids and to the youth, so that way we can build the next generation of family historians and preservationists. So that's going to be me over, at least say the next 10 years. That's my focus.